Dr. Chang originally asked me if I would be willing to give a presentation that described the adventures that my late wife, Sue Benford, and I underwent while putting together our hypothesis regarding the Shroud C14 samples. It was that the cloth had been rewoven, and that would explain why the 1988 C14 dating of the Turin Shroud, which I'll use the acronym TS from this point, came out medieval. He wanted it to focus more on the adventures than the evidence for or against it. I did put together a 20-minute presentation attempting to do that, but it was impossible to do without at least alluding to the evidence. He then asked if I could expand it to be a keynote address, which would give me a longer time than the 20 minutes, and suggested it would also be good to include other opinions why the C14 dating could have been an error. So what I'm about to present is my original Adventures saga, the 20-minute version, then followed in the second half by additional details regarding pertinent evidence, which includes a look into various ideas that have been promulgated about the nature of the 1988 C14 test. So there will be overlapping of timelines. Let's start setting the stage. After the 1988 C14 dating results were revealed as AD 1260 to 1390, various theories were put forth by proponents of the TS authenticity to explain why the dating could have been an error. One of the first ideas, immediately after the dating results, put forth by such syndenologists and archaeologists as the late Paul Maloney, the late Maria Grazia Ciliato, and William Meacham, was that the area from which the C14 sample was taken had been repaired, which would have thrown off the range given to the final tabulation results. Sue and I started to seriously look at that hypothesis in around early 2000. We concluded that based on the evidence we found, the sample dated was a combination of 1st century cloth and 16th century cloth. It was a fascinating research journey, some of which will be laid out here. While it has been very popular and has its share of proponents, including the late Ray Rogers of STURP, chemist, of the head chemist for the STURP team that studied the Shroud in 1978, many others disagree with it. In the early 2000s, Rogers had analyzed threads from the Reyes sample, which had been removed in 1973 for textile analysis, and that is named after the Belgian textile expert Gilbert Reyes, who had been given that sample in 1973 to study. The Reyes sample was right next to the area taken for the 1988 testing. Rogers had found indication that those threads were substantially different from threads in the main part of the cloth, which he had access to by virtue of the 1978 STURP study. He found starch, gum, dye, a mordant, which fixes the dye, and even a spliced linen cotton thread. The shroud is made of linen. But then in late 2003, he was given some leftover threads from the actual C14 sample. He found the same differences on those as he had on the Reyes samples. Several questions can be raised. Was the sample that Rogers was given actually from the Shroud C14 corner? Is it possible that visible evidence for the reweaving was eradicated with the sample excision? The TS had been attached to a backing cloth. Could some of the backing cloth fibers inadvertently been left in the C14 sample, including the portion that Rogers had been given? These questions, as well as analyses of various competing hypotheses, will be addressed. In June 1999, Sue and I attended our first TS conference together. It was held in Richmond, Virginia. The late Dr. Alan Adler, a blood expert from STIRP, which had studied the TS and its data from the 1978 study, presented a paper in which he presented data that indicated that the C14 sample area had different chemical characteristics than the rest of the TS. More on this later. That meant there was an indication that the C14 sample area was not representative of the whole cloth. Several different things could be the cause of that. Sue and I both had previously believed that the date had been thrown off because of the effect of the resurrection, but that would be something that would be hard to prove. The next conference to be held was going to be in late August 2000 in the small Italian town of Orvieto. And since it was so far away, it would be very expensive, Sue and I had no intention of going. Although we both believed the TS to be authentic despite the 88 C14 results, we were aware it would be hard to convince many people of its authenticity until there was a reasonable and solid reason why the C14 dating was wrong. Ever since I had met Sue, she asserted that she received special spiritual insights during meditation periods. She was uncannily accurate, so when she told me that she had an insight that the C14 area had been repaired, I wasn't going to dismiss it. For those who are interested, more details can be found in Sue's book, published in 2002 and republished in 2011, Strong Woman, Unshrouding the Secrets of the Soul, available on Amazon. We then looked at a high-quality photo of the C14 area and noticed possible indications that the area had been manipulated, but we were not textile experts. We needed to find someone who was. Sue took photographs of both the Zurich and the uncut C14 samples to European-trained weaver David Pearson, owner of the French Tailors in Columbus, Ohio. Pearson, who was not told that they were photographs of the shroud, immediately recognized the disparate weave pattern and differences in thread size, stating, quote, "There is no question that there is different material on each side. It is definitely a patch." By the way, because Pearson used the word patch, we started using it, but it really wasn't the best word to use for the technique we ultimately believe was used. Plus, that's the same word used to describe what the poor Clare nuns added all over the cloth after the 1532 fire. Pearson said that the medieval European weavers would typically try to match the original cloth and then hand stitch approximately 1/2 inch of new material into the old, such that it was invisible to all but the trained eye. This would ensure the long-term integrity of the material while maintaining aesthetic consistency throughout the fabric. This type of detail to repairs would be consistent with the wealth and devotion of the Savoy family, who owned the shroud at the time. Sue also sent photos to 2 other institutions without telling them that they were from the shroud. A blinded analysis of a photograph of the Zurich C14 sample by Thomas Ferguson and Company Limited, world-renowned makers of double damask linen, resulted in their perception that the sample was touched up to prevent unraveling. They further observed, "We have to say that we see the twill pattern clearly on both sides, but still there is something different left versus right." In a third blinded analysis of the Zurich C14 sample by Albany International, Louise Horner remarked that, quote, "The float is different on either side of the sample. It forms a thick-thin pattern on the right side, whereas the left is much more consistent throughout." And float is defined as a length of yarn on the surface of a woven fabric between two consecutive intersections of the yarn, with the yarns woven at right angles to it. Sue and I now felt we should submit a paper to the upcoming conference in Orvieto, Italy. The paper was accepted, so we started making our travel plans and continued to prepare the presentation. We had 30 minutes to deliver our paper. We practiced it over and over and always were able to get it under that time limit. During the actual presentation, as I was nearing the end, the moderator announced something in Italian. Not knowing any Italian, I wasn't sure what he said, but my first thought was that he was saying my time was up. I found it hard to believe I could be over the limit, given how many times we had practiced it. I launched into hyperspeed as I was determined to complete it. I was able to finish, but later found out I hadn't needed to rush. The moderator had actually announced that I had 2 minutes left. At that point, I regretted not having learned Italian, especially having the last name Marino. Before the Congress was over, we were approached by our producer from the National Geographic Channel, who was interested to talk to us because they were planning a TS documentary in the near future. Like researchers who had attended a special conference in Turin in March 2000, researchers who presented at the Orvieto conference were invited to send to the authorities proposals for tests. Sue and I submitted one related to C14 testing. Our Orvieto paper received a lot of positive reviews. In about mid-2001, Sue and I submitted to the journal Radiocarbon an updated version of the C14 paper that we had presented at Orvieto. After Sue and I presented our paper, an electronic version was published on Barry's site at Shroud.com. Rogers, who had first accepted the findings of the 1988 testing, had considered Sue and me to be part of the lunatic fringe and wasn't shy about telling the media, including in an interview on a Discovery Channel documentary from December 2008 called Unwrapping the Shroud, New Evidence. In the program, our Barry here recounts that Rogers called him after the article was published on the former site and said, "What the hell is this?" Barry admitted to me the language was a little saltier than that. Rogers told him that he could prove us wrong in 5 minutes. "Well, Ray," Barry replied, "go for it." Barry went on to say that in less than an hour, Rogers called him back and lamented, "I can't believe it. I think they're right." Rogers rolled up his chemist's sleeves and started doing serious research on the TS again. As a result, he soon warmed to Sue and me to the degree that we started to communicate with him, often by email. In October 2001, a TS conference was held in Dallas, Texas. We thought the organizers might want us to present a paper on the invisible weave hypothesis since it had such positive reviews, but they didn't. We then hoped to give a paper about an image formation hypothesis, and that's actually what I'm presenting on Saturday. But were treated so badly by the main organizer that we decided not to attend. We had told the organizers that our image formation paper was reviewed by two now deceased members of STIRP, Don Lynn and Al Adler. The main organizer told us in a letter that Lynn and Adler hadn't worked with us officially or non-officially. I would certainly like to know how the organizer knew what those gentlemen were doing non-officially. In the November 2001 issue of the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter, Rogers' article, Supportive Comments on the Benford-Marino 16th Century Repair Hypothesis, was published. He concluded, I believe it is quite clear that the material of the shroud is significantly different from both the Holland cloth and the Reyes sample from 1973. The samples used for the dating of 1988 were cut from immediately above the Reyes sample. It is very unfortunate that the C14 samples were not better characterized because the evidence shows that it is highly probable that the samples were not characteristic of the shroud and were spurious. We received regarding our submission to radiocarbon a letter dated January 1st, 2002 from Dr. Timothy Joel, the editor, who had been involved in the 1988 testing. For those not familiar with the process by which papers are published in scientific journals, the editor chooses various reviewers, usually anonymous to the author and supposedly objective, to make suggestions to the authors on how to make the paper better. After changes are made, the reviewers read the paper again and make their recommendations to the editor as to whether the paper should be published or not. However, the final decision is in the hands of the editor. The review of our paper was out of the ordinary insofar as the reviewers were revealed to us and also were all originally directly involved in the specific topic of our paper. 5 of the reviewers had been directly involved in the 1988 testing. What were the chances that any of these men, each of whom would publicly look bad if our hypothesis were correct, would want to see our paper published? The answer is obvious. Needless to say, our paper was not accepted. Most intriguing was a comment by the late French C14 scientist Jacques Avan, who wrote in the review sent to Sue and me, the authors, who for several reasons are convinced that the shroud is authentic, want to publish an article in Radiocarbon only to introduce a doubt about the dating. All people involved in the sampling and in laboratory analyses will be very angry with these suspicions turning on so an important mistake or a misconduct. It's an intriguing comment. I'm not 100% sure what he meant, but it sounds a little funny. And I'm pretty sure he didn't think we would end up seeing that comment. It was around 2002 when Sue and I were doing further research on textile repairs when we discovered reference to a specific technique called French reweaving or French invisible reweaving. When the phrase invisible reweaving surfaced, many questioned whether such a technique even existed. I now own 3 different manuals titled Invisible Mending, 1951, Invisible French Reweaving Simplified, 2 volumes, 1954, and The Frenway System of French Reweaving, 1962. Another criticism has been that such a repair on the shroud would easily be visible on the back side, which will be addressed later. According to the Frenway manual, probably the reason this art of reweaving has gone relatively unnoticed is the great secrecy which has heretofore kept all but a few people in the world in ignorance of the techniques involved. These secrets have been closely guarded and handed down from generation to a select few. The only exceptions were people who paid huge sums in order to receive knowledge of the art. Every novice reweaver had to spend years as an apprentice. And in the final word section on the last page of the book, if you do your work well, very few people will ever be able to detect what you have done. In your case, to have your workmanship invisible is the test of your craftsmanship. According to the late archaeologist Paul Maloney, the manual shows with drawn illustrations and with clearly written text each step what one must take to reproduce the technique known as French reweaving. Perhaps the single most significant feature of this method is that it uses no knots and therefore would not likely show up clearly on the x-rays unless one knew what they were looking for. On August 9, 2002, the shocking news was revealed that the Turin authorities had secretly performed a restoration on the shroud. Soon, many Italian newspapers were running stories about the so-called restoration, while adding details about the invisible reweave hypothesis. About midway through 2003, Sue and I felt the time was right to write the Cardinal of Turin to update him about the progress on the work related to the hypothesis. On July 20th, 2003, we sent a long, detailed letter by snail mail. It was basically the same proposal that we had submitted in 2000 when church authorities had asked for them. We actually received a reply back from the Cardinal of Turin who said, "All proposals for new examinations of the shroud are under the exam of a jury of scientists from which we await the judgment." But here we are 16 years later, still waiting. Robert Boudin, former president of Tapestries and Treasures, which produced, imported, exported, and distributed high-quality historical tapestries to clients throughout the world, including 16th century pieces, was specifically asked about the possibility of the shroud having an invisible reweave. He said, "Is there such a thing as an invisible repair? Yes, I have seen it, or more appropriately, not seen it, in several types of textiles. But was this skill known to weavers in the 16th century? Did weavers of the 16th century possess the skill to invisibly repair textiles? Most definitely. Would the restoration of a holy relic like the Shroud of Turin be assigned to a novice or the finest craftsman in the land? I think the latter. Was budget a concern for the church or its noble owner at the time? Most likely not. Nothing depicts this statement more accurately than touring the current-day Savoy Palace in Turin, which Sue and I had done in 2000 when we attended the Shroud exhibition that year. The Savoy family owned the shroud at the time that the reweave would have been done. And one cannot help but describe the magnificent tapestries and other things there seen throughout the palace as opulent, lavish, and ornate. The possibility of an invisible reweave into a linen textile in the 16th century was brought to the attention of Dr. Thomas P. Campbell, Associate Curator, European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Campbell, primary author of Tapestry in the Renaissance, Art and Magnificence, wrote us by email, "All of the major European courts had teams of skilled weavers and embroiderers who were employed in the repair of high-quality textiles. Identifying 16th century repairs is not easy. 18th and 19th century repairs are much easier." When asked if he had any images of an actual invisible weave repair done in the 16th century, Dr. Campbell responded, "No, I don't have such an image. As I said, it is very difficult to identify such repairs. They certainly must exist. The 16th century weavers were magicians, but I can't think of any documented examples. For those who contend that because there is no perfect example of a 16th century invisible reweave, or that it can't be duplicated today, there are multiple ancient achievements that can't be explained by modern science, which can be shown by a simple Google search. During the spring of 2004, we learned that something momentous did occur at the end of 2003. In April 2004, an article on the National Geographic website revealed that Rogers had been given a leftover portion of the sample that had been used in the 1988 dating. He had done all his previous work on the Reyes sample. As mentioned previously, this Reyes sample had been right next to the actual sample used in the 88 dating. He had been reluctant to say that what he found on the former would be found on the latter. But now that he had the actual C14 sample, he could compare the two. To practically no one's surprise, everything that he found on the Reyes sample was present on the C14 sample. This was huge news. It greatly solidified his theory that the C14 sample was anomalous. It also added support to our idea that the sample area had been probably rewoven, and I think moved it into the realm of a theory. The article also stated that his findings were being submitted to a peer-reviewed scientific journal, which meant that other scientists would be reviewing his research, and if it were accepted, there would be a solid scientific basis for accepting the theory. Can we be sure that Rogers actually did receive a bona fide leftover sample from the Shroud? I have an email from Rogers on file dated February 9th, 2005, in which he talks about the custody. He said, "I have now received a letter from the AMSTAR, which is American Shroud Turin Association for Research, lawyer describing the handling of the samples. They were taken by Ganella, scientific advisor to the Cardinal, and they were subsequently transferred to Al Adler. He transferred the yarn segments I used to Stephen Mattingly. Mattingly stated to me," this is Rogers still talking, "in a retained email that he never even looked at them. And Mattingly sent them back after Al's death. AMSTAR has the handwritten note from Al to Mattingly, and all of the shipping envelopes have been saved. I was specifically directed to save all of this material and return it. I did." On December 16th, 2018, I learned from Barry via phone that AMSTAR member and former STIRT member, Tom D. Mahola, had sent Barry a letter confirming the chain of custody. All of Rogers' findings regarding the C14 sample area were published in a peer-reviewed journal in January 2005. It was also in January when Sue was diagnosed with breast cancer. So we had another battle on our hands, this one with frightening seriousness. Sue researched every means possible to try and overcome this, and we continued on as best as we could. Sue had been a nurse and was already familiar with much of the breast cancer research, so we were hopeful she would be able to find a viable treatment. The Turin Centro at first contested Rogers' findings, but then quickly followed up with a more open-minded statement in a periodic newsletter they had published. It alluded to materials that both Rogers and Adler had found in the sample area, suggesting that the area had been repaired. It also alluded to the 2002 restoration. But they asserted because this, quote, has not been confirmed by the textile experts and researchers who have examined it, end quote, to conclude that a repair exists would be, in their words, a rash conclusion. So, Sue and I wondered under what circumstances would cotton and coloring agents for dyeing have been used without a repair of some kind. And how did they try to determine if a repair had taken place? Apparently, it was just a visual inspection and a simplistic optical device, neither of which would reveal any detailed chemical compositions. Although the official reason for having done the 2002 restoration was for the conservation of the shroud, it is interesting that it is not mentioned when they said the most recent tests made in 2002 were carried out to discover any possible traces of such work, referring to the invisible relief hypothesis, in the light of similar hypotheses already made several years ago. Their statement leaves one with the impression that finding signs of a repair was more on their minds than the official reason of conservation. Then, less than 2 months after Roger's paper was published, he died. We vowed to keep going despite Sue's recent diagnosis and Roger's death. We learned there was going to be another TS conference in Dallas in September 2005. It was sponsored by the same group in 2001, which still had the same main organizer. We had found additional supporting information about our reweave theory and hoped to present a paper despite how badly we had been treated in 2001. But the organizer was requiring speakers to submit the full text of their paper before the conference and would not allow any changes to be made after submission. Since we did not like those restrictions, and because we had found out that the organizer, get this, posing as the Cardinal of Turin, had sent an email to Roger's widow asking her to send back to Turin any leftover samples he had, we decided not even to submit the paper. We were actually concerned that the organizer might pilfer some of our material. Right before the conference, I happened to reread a small booklet from 1998 that had been written by Professor Piero Savarino, who was the scientific advisor to Cardinal Paletto. To the shock of Sue and me, Savarino stated that the 1988 C14 testing might have been erroneous due to, quote, extraneous thread left over from invisible mending routinely carried out in the past on parts of the cloth in poor repair. Savarino went on to emphasize, if the sample taken had been the subject of invisible mending, the carbon dating results would not be reliable. What is more, the site from which the samples actually were taken does not preclude this hypothesis. This was quite a startling statement coming from a very high Turin official. We asked the Dallas organizers, without much confidence, if we could present our paper informally on the Friday night when there would be no official presentations. Much to our surprise, we were allowed to do so, and quite a few of the attendees came to the presentation and complimented it. The morning after our presentation, we ran into Susie Phillips, the translator for members of the Turin Centro who did not speak or read English well. We mentioned our paper to her, and she asked if she could have a copy of the paper to pass along to the Centro members. We naturally agreed. A few days after the conference ended, we sent Susie Phillips an updated version of the paper and asked her to keep it confidential. On September 13, 2005, she emailed us she would be passing it along to all members of the Turin Centro. We informed her that the updated version would be published on berryshroud.com. Textile expert Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg emailed us a few days later and said that while she agreed with our historical research, invisible mending was not possible on linen. But we continued to find various pieces of evidence that seemed to indicate invisible mending in the C14 sample area. The late microscopist John Brown, who checked the Reyes samples Rogers had worked with, confirmed Rogers' findings of an apparent medieval repair. Sorry about that. I thought I turned it off. In August 2008, Sue and I had a new peer-reviewed article about the reweave theory published in the Italian journal Chemistry Today. In that article, we wrote, "Historical evidence demonstrates that it was not only possible for medieval weavers and embroiderers to invisibly mend textiles such that they were not topside detectable, but it is also recognized that they could choose whether or not to permit their handiwork from being detected on the backside as well." And then we also had a quote in the paper, which I'll read here. "Historically, reweaving was not carried out through a support fabric and was often executed so skillfully that it is not always recognizable as a later addition, although differences in the rate of dye fading have often revealed its presence. Evidence of reweaving would now," referring to the 16th century, "usually be left deliberately visible on the reverse of the tapestry by the presence of the warp ends and knots." Recall that I quoted Maloney earlier saying that in French reweaving there are no telltale knots that would indicate the presence of a reweave on the back side. And this is that 2-volume manual on French reweaving, and in this they say, "Occasionally you may be asked to reweave a damage invisibly on both sides. Invisibility is achieved on both sides by applying the face weaving method to the back side of the fabric with a slight variation in the lock-in procedure. After pickbacks have been made, the needle is inserted some distance to the right of the first one and then glided through the fabric between the top and bottom surfaces. The needle must be kept hidden within the fabric until brought out at the pickback. On the left side of damage, the procedure is reversed. The needle enters at the point of lock-in and then glides through the fabric and comes out some distance to the left. Thus, when the protruding ends of the replacement thread is clipped close to the surface, the lock-ins will not show from either side." In September 2008, a documentary crew from the Discovery Channel came to our house and filmed us for Unwrapping the Shroud, New Evidence, which was shown for the first time on December 22nd. They even managed to get a clip of our cute little dog in there. Also in 2008, a 9-person team at Rogers' old lab, the Los Alamos National Laboratories, confirmed that the C14 sample examined by Rogers had cotton intertwined with the linen. Cotton is not found anywhere else on the shroud. The lead person, the late chemist Robert Villarreal, later wrote in a paper regarding the difference between the main part of the cloth and the C14 sample area. The cloth is much less fluorescent in the radiocarbon sampled area. An ultraviolet fluorescence photograph shows a different chemical composition in this area. The Reyes sample and the radiocarbon threads show colored encrustations on their surfaces. There were absolutely no encrustations on the Holland cloth or main shroud fibers. Reyes thread number 1 shows distinct encrustations and color on one end, and the other end is nearly white. The fibers from the two ends point in opposite directions. This thread sample was obviously an end-to-end splice of 2 different threads of yarn. No splice was observed on the main cloth. There is a gum coating on the radiocarbon dating sample, which is found nowhere on the main shroud cloth. And I will later show a photomicrograph showing an example of the encrustations that Villarreal refers to. In January 2009, Sue's cancer worsened. She had not been able to find a treatment to stave off the disease, and she quickly went downhill. In April, at Easter time, as she lay dying in the hospice, the Discovery Channel rebroadcast a documentary which was showing in her room. And it was nice that the doctors and nurses attending to her could see her as she had been before that terrible disease took its toll. I was totally devastated. But over the years, Sue would make her presence known to me in various ways, one of which I will relate now. Interesting incident happened as I was preparing my papers for this conference some months ago. There's a term for what had happened, which is called, it's a synchronicity, which Carl Jung defined as meaningful coincidence. In December 2018, I was writing the 3 papers I'm presenting at this conference. On the day that I finished the original version, the 20-minute version of the Reweave paper, something remarkable happened. I posted the following to my Facebook page that afternoon. This is pretty amazing to me. I've been preparing 3 papers for a Shroud conference to be held in Canada in August 2019. The first 2 papers are part 1 and 2 of a Shroud topic that was more Sue's than mine. The third is a paper that recounts the adventures we went through putting together our invisible reweave theory, which could explain why the Shrouds dating in 1988 came out medieval. I finished the 3rd paper this afternoon, and a few minutes after I finished it, I retrieved the mail. One of the pieces was from Danbury Mint, and the cover of the notice said, "Joseph, Sue will be thrilled to receive the I Love You personalized diamond pendant." I was struck that I saw this only minutes after finishing 3 papers pertaining to our research. Sue had been gone, believe it or not, almost 10 years. What is inscribed on the pendant is, "Sue, I loved you then, I love you still, I always have, I always will, Joseph." What really struck me about those words is the fact that 2 of those lines match exactly to lines from what was Sue and I, our song called "Broken Dream" by Justin Hayward of the Moody Blues, in which the 2nd stanza reads, "Even the smallest traces of your sweet perfume open the floodgates and I'm helpless. Now as the moonlight shadows cast across my room, only the whispered words are heard in the night, only a silent prayer. I love you still, I always will." I am really touched in this moment. The postscript to this was that within a few days of this happening, Dr. Chang emailed me and said he would like me to expand my 20-minute version into a keynote address and address other hypotheses challenging the 88 dating. I told people I was sure that was Sue from the other side twisting Dr. Chang's arm to give me more time for this presentation. I feel... Excuse me?
I needed to fill the time.
Whatever. I feel fortunate to have spent an incredible 10.5 years with that remarkable woman, and we're going to take a 15-minute break.